All right. Welcome to this evening's episode of Talks at New Haven. I'm one of your hosts, Josh Robinson, and joining me this evening, as always, is my co-host,
Alton Booth.
And on today's episode, Alton and I are going to be surveying a couple of chapters in Genesis. We're going to be surveying chapters 16 and 17. So because we have so much text to survey today, we're not going to actually bring it up on screen like we typically do. Because it's just too much. We have too much to survey, and we've got a lot to survey because, oh goodness, everything that could possibly happen to keep us from recording in studios happened, right? You got hit with COVID a few weeks ago, and then we got hit with it here, last week, so we weren't able to do anything. So
we've just not been able to be down here.
Yeah.
We had snowstorm last week. We ended up having to cancel church because of snow.
That's right.
So it's just been a fun few weeks.
Yeah, tons of interesting things have happened. So anyway, if you guys are watching live, give this video a like, give it a share it out with your friends. And also, if you're interested in Genesis, we're going to be digging back in today, and so should be interesting. A lot to cover here.
Yeah.
And some interesting topics I'm sure that we're going to get into. And
we will.
So anyway. All right, Alton. Well, I'll let you take it from the top. I don't know how you want to get started on it, but I'll let you kind of direct our conversation.
Well, I will just start here at the beginning of chapter 16.
Okay.
I'll start reading. If something catches my attention, I'll stop and bring it up.
Okay.
If something catches your attention, just stop me, and we will go from there.
Sounds like a plan.
And then we'll do some kind of broad overview stuff of the two chapters. Really, in these two chapters, there's three main story points to hit on.
Yeah.
So once we finish getting through them, we'll hit on those three story points, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
So starting here in chapter 16, verse 1, says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Mm-hmm. So we remember here at the end of this is after Abram has been promised people. He's been promised nations.
Yep.
And a lot of people that will come from his line. And they've not had children yet, right?
Yep. That's right.
So verse 2, And Sarai said to Abram, Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife.
Yeah.
And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress.
Yeah.
So we're at a point now where they're trying to have offspring,
right,
to fulfill the promise that God had given them.
That's right. God had given them a promise in the chapter previously with the Abrahamic covenant.
Right, and so Abram decides after Sarai convinces him to sleep with her servant Hagar.
Right.
And Hagar does become pregnant, and then she looks with contempt upon her mistress.
Yeah.
So now she dislikes Sarai at this point.
Yeah.
Probably for obvious reasons.
Yeah, she's treated her like a piece of property.
Right. She's not been treated very well.
No.
At this point. So verse 5, And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. So I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you.
Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but back at the beginning of this chapter, this wasn't Abram's idea.
Right. No, it was Sarai's.
So why is Sarai angry at Abram for following the plan that she made?
Women. No,
and I'll make sure everyone knows Josh said that. That was not me.
I'm just playing. Well, I think that a lot of it, she wasn't planning on Hagar to, react the way that she reacts, and she's very upset with her, and the text doesn't give us all of the details, but I'm assuming it's that, it's it's kind of like, hey, you're my servant, right? And Hagar is more than a servant; she's a person, and she's reacted to this, and so I think that's probably some of what's going on here.
And I would also wonder if maybe Sarai didn't think it would actually happen.
Could be.
Abram's 100 years old.
Well, she certainly later on doesn't think she's capable of
Right, so
reproducing.
maybe she didn't think Abram was capable.
Yeah.
And that's part of why she's upset.
Yeah.
So just to, I know it's getting a little bit off topic, but you see, and
Let the Lord between you or me.
right, these are people.
Yeah.
We tend to forget that. To be completely honest, we tend to forget that the characters in the Bible were humans.
Yeah.
With real human emotion.
Yeah.
Now, if you see sometimes, and this may be a little bit of a sensitive subject, you see a couple that is struggling to conceive.
Right.
And they go and they get tested and they have all these tests done.
Yeah.
And they find out, okay, we're struggling because of the man.
Right.
He's not able.
Yep.
Or we're struggling because she's not able.
Yeah.
You see anger there sometimes.
Sometimes.
So
yeah.
this is a confirmation in Sarai's mind that
It's
her
me.
body is not capable.
That's right.
So that could be where some of the anger here comes from.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So getting down into verse 6, but Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please."
Yeah.
So we see here Abram, and one of the church fathers mentioned this a little bit. We see here that Abram is able to take these two women and kind of treat them both well. Like, he doesn't treat Hagar poorly.
Right.
He treats them both well, but he also treats them in the way that, as a man of God, he should. He holds his wife in higher esteem than his acquaintance,
Right.
for lack of better words.
Right.
And he says, hey, I am your husband. This is your decision to make.
Right.
I won't get in your way.
Yeah.
So then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Okay, so now we're going to get to an interesting section here.
Yeah.
It started in verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness,
Right.
the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for the multitude.
Yeah.
And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man,
Right.
his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him.
Yeah.
And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen.
Yeah. There's a few interesting things there.
You're right.
There's quite a bit to dig in here. First is the identity of the angel of the Lord, and then beyond the identity of the angel of the Lord, some of the promise that's given by the angel of the Lord to her, and then her reaction to the angel of the Lord. So I'm just going to go ahead, since we don't have a ton of time, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you who I think that the angel of the Lord is. I think that the angel of the Lord is a Christophany. I think that it's Jesus.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yep, and there's a few reasons why. As we see the angel of the Lord appear in other places in Scripture, we're going to see the angel of the Lord appear in Exodus 15:22. He's going to appear to Moses at the burning bush, right? And Moses is going to fall down before him. That whole thing. Then we're going to see whenever Israel comes out of Egypt, they're going to be led by the angel of the Lord. Whenever we hit the New Testament in Jude, let me find it here. In Jude, right before Revelation, here's what Jude says. He says, this is in verse 5 of Jude chapter 1. There's only one chapter in Jude. But he says, I want to remind you all, though you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe.
Right.
So he identifies the angel of the Lord who led Israel out of Egypt as Jesus. And so that's why I think that the angel of the Lord is Jesus.
Right, and I think the only other realistic option for the angel of the Lord would be Michael.
Yeah.
But when we see Michael brought in as the angel of the Lord, it says, Michael, an angel of the Lord.
Yeah, that's right.
It doesn't specify a name with the angel of the Lord here, so that leads me to go along with you there that it's probably a Christophany.
Yep, and I think her response as well seems to give away that this is a theophany, that she recognizes this to be God.
Yeah.
So she let me find it here.
It's in verse 13.
Yeah, verse 13. She called to the name of the Lord who spoke to her. So Moses is identifying the angel of the Lord as the Lord. He said, and she says, "You are a God of seeing. You are an Elohim of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." And so therefore she calls the well Bir Lahoi Roy, and it lies between Kadesh and Bered. So basically she recognizes the angel of the Lord as the Lord, the God who sees her. Okay, so that's interesting. So she seems to think that this is the Lord. And Moses, in the way that he writes the passage and structures it, seems to think that as well,
right.
Which you can see why. He's had an encounter with the angel of the Lord himself, so that's interesting. But the other thing here that's interesting is she's given a promise, and it seems to mirror a surface.
So, well, before we get to
Go
the
ahead.
promise, she's given some commands from the angel of the Lord.
That's right.
I'll give him one command anyway. So the angel of the Lord asked her, "Where are you going?" She said, "I'm fleeing from my mistress." Right. And what does the angel of the Lord say to her?
You need to go back. Return
to your mistress and submit to her. So in our congregation right now, this is a big word.
This is a big word.
Submit is a big word because we've been going through
Colossians.
the book of Colossians in our midweek series, and I tried really hard to get out of teaching the passage that said, "Wives, submit to your husbands."
Yep.
I managed to stretch it out 2 months before I actually had to teach it. But we've talked a lot about submission,
right?
And that when we see submission here, it's not a blind submission,
no,
but it's a submission to someone who is deserving of being submitted to and followed.
Yeah, this is she's a part, as we're going to see, and her son's going to receive the mark of the covenant in chapter 17. But they're a part of this home, and they're under the headship of Abram and Sarai. And so as a bondservant, a slave, whatever you want to call her, she is under their federal headship. She is in that covenant home. And so that's why the angel of the Lord says, "Hey, go back and submit to her."
Right. And after we finish chapter 17, we'll see that there may be some significance to her being told to return. Yeah. We'll look at some, after we get through all of the verses we're going through, we'll look at some quotes, and we'll look at a quote from Cyril of Alexandria. Yeah. Talking about Sarah and Hagar. Yeah. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but that could lead to some significance for why she's told to go back. Yeah. But after she's told to go back, that's where we get the promise that the angel of the Lord makes. And as you were getting ready to say, it's kind of reminiscent of the promise made to Abraham, right?
On the surface, it seems that way.
So, "I will surely multiply your offspring, so they could not be numbered for multitude." Yeah. Now, to Abraham was told to go outside, right? Look up to the sky. Yep. Number the stars. Right. If you can.
Yeah, if you can.
And your offspring will be greater than that number. Right. So, do you think there's significance to the slight variation in the promise that's given?
Yeah, at first I hadn't really noticed. I mean, I had noticed that it was reminiscent and similar, but there was a church father that we were looking at and reading earlier who notes a thing that I think is very significant. So he notes that the difference between the two is Abram's descendants are described as being like the stars, right? So stars are related to sons of God, Genesis 6, that entire thing. Not going down that rabbit hole right now. Right. But sons of God, stars, luminous bodies, that kind of thing, right? And so basically Abram's descendants, they're going to be like stars. They're going to be they're going to become sons of God. They're going to be luminous. Later on in Genesis, Joseph's going to have a dream. His father is going to be pictured as the sun. His mother's going to be pictured as the moon. And his 12 brothers, who will be the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, are going to be pictured as 12 stars that are bowing. They're all bowing down to him. So Abram's descendants are depicted as luminous stars. They're fixed in the heavenlies with God, and they are God's sons. They are the sons of God. Later on, Israel's going to be called his firstborn son.
Right.
So that's in Exodus 1, I think. I'd have to go back and look. So that's why they have the star language. Now, Hagar's doesn't have that.
Right. Hers says a lot.
Hers
but
says...
it doesn't say more numerous than the stars.
That's right.
So there's a couple things there that I see. And just for reference, that quote comes from the Genesis commentary from Didymus the Blind. If you're wanting to look that up, I'll go ahead and warn you, he has some out there stuff in his commentary, but some of it's really good.
Yeah.
So we see a couple things here with it being stars, right? If you were a sailor at night, especially back before we had all the technology we have now, how'd you find your way?
Yeah, you navigated by the stars.
You followed the stars.
That's right.
You didn't follow the multitude to navigate your way. And so there's going to be some significance there, even with people traveling throughout the Middle East at that time. That's how they would navigate at night.
Yeah.
They would follow the stars. We see that in the birth of Christ. Right? How did they find the Christ child?
The star. Yep, that's right. And, a lot of it, too, is going to have to do with the vocation of Israel. They're supposed to be a light to the nations in darkness that's been handed over to the sons of God, that entire thing. So there's a lot to that. But so it's interesting that Hagar's descendants don't get that. They're not luminous. They're not going to be sons of God. And it's a historical topic of inquiry who her descendants are, and a lot of people say that they are Muslims, and they claim to have come from Ishmael as well, and they claim that that Ishmael was the chosen covenant son rather than Isaac was. But here in the text, that's not what we see. We actually see that he's going to be a part of the Abrahamic covenant, but he's not the chosen heir. He's not the son through who the Messiah is going to come. And so there could be some of that tied into with the whole luminous body part. These people are going to be God's chosen people. These other people are not.
Right.
So
then moving on, you already read down through verses 13 and 14.
Yeah.
So we'll pick back up in 15. It says, "And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael."
Yep.
Abram was 86 years old, so he wasn't quite 100 yet.
Right.
So we'll get later on. We'll see that Abram was, Ishmael. I'll get the name out in a minute.
It's tough.
Ishmael was 14 when Abram and Sarai had a son.
Yeah.
So now we're going to get down into
17.
Chapter 17, and I'm going to go ahead and preface this with in the ESV. ESV will have section headings, right? The section heading at the start of chapter 17 says Abraham and the covenant of circumcision. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that out there first, that's going to be the next topic of conversation.
Right.
So just prepare yourself to hear the word circumcision quite a bit.
And possibly foreskin.
Yeah, so Derek completely skipped over that word, but he read the scripture.
He refused to read the word foreskin. He replaced it with flesh.
So we'll get into chapter 17. It says here, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty.
Yeah.
Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly."
Yeah. So this is a repetition of the covenant promise already given to him, but without some of the luminous parts to it. But.
Right. So, and I just saw something here that we will touch on later that I did not see before, and we were kind of talking about it before we came on the air. So starting in verse 3, "Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations."
Yeah. So
we saw in chapter 16 that Ishmael would be the father of multitudes,
Right.
but Abram is going to be the father of multitude of nations.
Right. Yeah.
So instead of being the father of a lot of people, he's going to be the father of a lot of nations,
Yeah.
which is significantly more people.
Significantly. And that's, I think that's what the name, the name Abram means high father, which was kind of ironic. His name was High Father, but yet he had no son.
Right.
And the name Abraham, I'm pretty sure in Hebrew, means the father of many nations. So he has a name. He has a name change to correspond with what's going to happen.
Right here in verse 5. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations.
That's it. Yep.
I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you.
Yeah.
So we see there the first bit of kingly language here, that kings are going to come from him. So we can say kings, as in the kings of Israel, which we have many.
Sure.
And then there's also a specific king that is tied into this promise as well.
And then there's going to be a kingly people who are going to be
Coming from that
specific
right?
king. Yeah. So interesting.
So, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you.
Yeah.
So we see here this is an everlasting covenant.
Yep.
God is always going to be their God. Right?
Yep.
Now, that gets us into a discussion, though.
Yeah.
So if this is an everlasting covenant to the descendants of Abraham, that God will always be their God, does that mean that God is the God of the Jewish people today, and the Jewish people are his people?
Yeah. Interesting question. So Paul deals with this quite a bit throughout his letters in the New Testament. And, basically what he's going to tell them is being a fleshly descendant of Abraham is not enough to receive the promised blessing of his covenant. So in Galatians, I believe it's chapter 3, Paul is going to say that those who are of faith are Abraham's descendants and have been blessed along with Abram, who is the man of faith. So, and then in Romans 11, which we spent 3 years preaching through Romans,
Right.
Paul says in Romans 11 that those the Jews who did not believe in Messiah, in Jesus, they were cut off from the covenant.
Right, and the Gentiles who did believe were grafted into the covenant.
That's exactly right. So basically what happens is the promise is to these people, but in order to receive the blessing of the covenant, which ultimately is Christ, you must have faith.
Right.
You can be in the covenant, but being in the covenant is not a guarantee that you're actually saved. So, for example, we're going to see people here shortly who will be circumcised, but who will have no faith in the promised seed of Abraham,
Right.
or in the promise given to Abraham that he will bless the nations. We're going to see people, and they're going to be cut off. And the same thing with people who are baptized. We see people all the time who are baptized, have the covenant sign of the new covenant, yet who don't believe.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay, so getting down into verse 8, we have God continuing to speak to Abraham here. And he says, "And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised."
Yep.
So you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant.
Yep.
So this is fairly straightforward stuff here, right?
Yep. I've made a covenant with you, Abraham. Here's the sign of that covenant. Here's who you need to apply it to.
Right. So you apply it to you,
Yep.
your offspring,
Yep.
the offspring of the people that live in your house,
That's right.
the offspring of any people you have bought,
Yep.
and anyone who does not take this mark, they have to leave.
Yep. They're not a part of the covenant.
It's that simple. It's really straightforward.
That's right. Yep.
So now we'll get down into verse 15.
Yep. This is our text from today.
Right, this is our text from today, and this is talking more about Isaac now.
Yep.
At this point. So, verse 15, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name.
Sarah's going to get her name changed here.
Right.
Just in the same way that Abraham had it changed in the last unit. So.
Yep. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her.
Yep.
So this is the same promise given to Abraham that applies to his offspring, but it does not apply to Ishmael.
That's right.
So it's important to make that distinction. This is for his offspring. That is not Ishmael.
That's right. Yep. Ishmael's going to be a part of the covenant. He's going to receive the covenant mark, but he is not going to be the promised seed. And it looks as though like he's not going to obtain the blessing of the covenant either.
Right.
So he's one of those covenant. There's a distinction between people in the scriptures. There are covenant keepers and covenant breakers.
Right.
And so he falls into the category of covenant breaker.
Yep.
Yep.
So now into verse 17. And this is one where we may have a little bit of discussion on this verse.
Sure.
So verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you.
Right.
So we see here, Abraham is given this promise. He's told Sarah is going to have a son. And this son is going to be the son of promise. This son is going to be the son that I have given to you in this covenant.
Yeah.
Right? And Abraham falls to his face and laughs.
Yeah.
And then he asks, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old?
Yeah.
So I've always read this, and this is a couple of reasons for that. I've always read this as Abraham laughing in unbelief.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
He's laughing and he's saying, really? I'm 100 years old.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have a son with my 90-year-old wife.
Yeah. Seems likely, bro.
That's the way I've always read it. Now, we do have, coming from, let me remember who said it here.
Was it Didymus the Black?
No, this was actually from Ambrose.
Okay.
As a church father, saying that his laughter here was not laughter of unbelief, but laughter of joy.
Yeah.
And he says that because before he laughs, and this kind of makes sense, it says he fell on his face.
Right, which is a posture of worship.
Right, I'm actually going to back up to verse number, where was it?
It was 2, I think. 2 to 3. Abraham fell on his face.
Right, verse 3.
Yeah.
Then Abram fell on his face.
Yeah.
So God appeared to him. Abram fell on his face in worship, right?
Right.
So now here we are in verse 17, and he's falling on his face again.
Yep.
So we have in this same chapter
Yep.
it being shown that this is a sign of worship.
Yep. So you can see why he could come to that conclusion.
Right. He takes the position of worship, and then he laughs. But if we go to the next chapter, so not to step on Travis's toes too much for next week.
He better be watching this if he wants
But
some
if
official
we go
commentary.
to the next chapter, and we are looking at, let me find where it was here.
This is official New Haven Papal commentary.
Or was it chapter 19?
It was, I thought it was chapter 18.
I thought it was too, and I'm not seeing it now.
It's I think it's in verse 9.
Okay, yeah, it starts in that area there
Yep.
in verse 9 in chapter
Yep.
18.
12 is the verse.
Right. So it starts in verse 10, though. Yep. And so in verse 10, the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abram, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? And here's where we can tell that her laugh was a laugh of unbelief.
Right.
Because in verse 15, Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh. So if it was a laugh of worship, would she have denied laughing?
Right.
It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of unbelief. And that's why she denied having laughed there.
Yeah, it seems like that's a parallel between the two.
Right.
Especially if you take Abraham's previous behavior of unbelief into account. I mean, you could make an argument either way, but I tend to lean in that way.
Right, and you can kind of see the falling on his face as another time that God appears to him.
Yeah.
Like, God has appeared in front of Abraham. He falls to his face.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Abraham does. Also, I find it hard to give Abraham the benefit of the doubt here, knowing his character from the previous few chapters.
Yeah.
So we've seen multiple times that it says that, well, we talked about it before the covenant in chapter 15. Chapter 14, I think it is, ends with saying, and his faith was counted to him as righteousness. And then the next chapter starts with him doubting what he was told.
Right.
So we see that repeatedly in Abraham's story, right?
Yeah. And then in 15, you get the covenant ceremony made with him. And then in 16, he tries to manufacture the promise himself by taking Hagar. Well, Sarai gives him Hagar, but
yeah. So we see his character as one that is not always the most faithful, and not always the most believing. Mm-hmm. So then getting into verse 18, and Abraham said to God, talked about that one, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Mm-hmm. So he said, okay, if I'm going to have a son, the actual son of the covenant, the actual son of promise, let my other son live as well.
Right.
Don't give me this son to fulfill the covenant and then kill the son that I created outside of the covenant.
Right.
And verse 19, God said, no, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant. So we see that phrase there again. Yep. An everlasting covenant for his offspring. Times. So we see again, this is an everlasting covenant for the offspring of Isaac. Yep. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him. So this is the son born outside of the covenant. I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. Now, this is significant here. He shall father 12 princes.
Yeah.
I will make him into a great nation.
Yeah.
Now, why do you think the 12 princes is significant? Of course, the number 12 is significant.
Right.
That's a very important number for the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
But what have we seen promised repeatedly to Abraham and then again to Sarah?
Yeah.
There will be kings coming from their line.
Right.
Ishmael will have princes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's a step down. Right. It's a step down, and it's showing again Ishmael is not the seed of promise. And even though God is going to show, you could say, a common grace to him, it's not going to be quite like the special grace that's going to come to Isaac.
So we talked about with the kings being promised to Abraham and to Sarah, that there's one specific king that is promised in that covenant as well, right?
That's right. So
if we look at the names of Christ, though, he's the King of Kings.
That's right.
Is he not also the Prince of Peace?
He is the Prince of Peace. That's right.
So we see that Christ is both a king and a prince.
That's right.
Which means the people of the Jewish covenant are they belong to Christ.
Yeah.
Because he is the king.
That's right.
But the people that are not of the covenant have also been won to Christ as princes through the Prince of Peace as well.
It's a great connection.
So I'm not positive if that's
Well,
what he's
interesting.
getting at, but there's something there, I think.
Well, man, there's a lot that I could say about this. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too much because I'm going to end up talking about giants. but I can see that. I'll say that.
Okay, so now we'll move on to verse 21. It says, But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. So God just talked for a while, and then he left.
Yep.
Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him.
Yep.
So we see here, again, Abraham's faith.
Yep.
Which, like I was saying, is kind of a pattern with him. Mm-hmm. His faith, God tells him something, and he's, all right, let's jump in.
Yep, he's in it.
So he takes all of these men, and we know from previous chapters, Abraham had a lot of men.
Oh, yeah. He had
like
a
so
militia.
many men that he and Lot could not live in the same valley because there was too many people and they overwhelmed the resources of the valley, so they had to separate.
And he had so many people that he was able to take down the kings from the east.
Right. So there's a lot of men here, and Abraham went out that very day and circumcised them all.
It's a lot of circumcising.
Like that is a lot.
Yeah.
That day.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder, did Abraham save himself for last, or did he start with himself?
I don't know.
And then went and got everybody else.
Yeah, I don't know, but
I don't know which one would be easier for him.
I would say saving himself for last would be easier.
About to say, I'd probably practice on some other guys first.
That's probably what I would do. There's a chiasm here in this passage that starts with Abraham taking Ishmael and all that was born and that were bought, and every male in Abraham's house. The center of the chiasm is Abraham was 90, Ishmael was 13. So why that's the main point here, I don't know. Maybe it's just showing that the sign of the covenant was applied, and it was applied to these two people at this age. I'm guessing that's what Moses is doing by the literary structure of the passage here. But yeah, so interesting stuff. But
so then verse 24, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin.
yeah.
That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. And all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him.
Why do you think God said to circumcise the infants on the 8th day?
That's it's an interesting fact.
It's a speculation.
Right. So it's kind of laughing at something Derek said last week. But Derek had some pretty decent scientific points for that.
Yeah. So the point was that he made in his sermon last week was that on the 8th day, I think it was, I can't remember what vitamin it was. There was a certain vitamin or something
that's
similar to that.
responsible for the clotting of blood that is the strongest on the 8th day.
The 8th day, yeah. And so he was kind of making the case that God, as being the creator of humans, knows this, and that was the particular day that he chose. The day that would be the highest. So, interesting.
Right. So that covers those two chapters.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned I want to bring up this quote from Cyril of Alexandria.
Yeah.
And I want to let you talk about this quote a little bit. It's an interesting quote.
Yeah.
So this is Cyril of Alexandria talking about the sense of the covenant being eternal.
Yeah.
Referencing Genesis 17:11, where the covenant is called an eternal covenant. And so what he says is, in what sense is the covenant eternal?
Yeah.
One interpretation is that it is eternal according to the one promising. Right. For the things of God are not conditioned, but relative to us, eternal things become time conditioned.
Yeah.
So he's saying it's eternal because God's eternal.
Right.
But it doesn't seem eternal to us because we have beginnings and ends.
Right.
Another interpretation is that even when the covenant with Israel was abolished, it was maintained for us, and we are God's people in place of them. Circumcision took over a second territory after the faith came. For just as the birth of the illegitimate child came first, after the promise of the legitimate one, because the birth of the latter was likewise belated, so now circumcision came first, because the time for the spiritual circumcision was not yet. But when this new one appears, the other circumcision is thrown out. For in Christ Jesus, we say, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is of any avail.
Yeah. It's a fascinating quote, honestly, because you can see what he's doing there. And I don't think that he's wrong. I think that he's spot on. We've already alluded to this earlier when we were talking about Romans 11 and then Galatians chapter 3, that those who were unbelieving Jews have been cut off from God. I mean, that's why Paul opens up Romans 9 the way that he does. He's like, I wish that I was accursed for my kinsmen. They've been cut off, and I wish that I was cut off for them so that they would know God. And so he's saying that basically Israel is like Ishmael in that they came first, but they also didn't receive Messiah.
Right.
Like kind of like how Ishmael is not the seed of promise. But then comes Isaac, who is the seed of promise. And he talks about that this relates to the church, which he's not wrong, because later on Paul is going to talk about their mothers being allegories. And he says...
For the Old Testament, the New Testament.
That's right. He says that Hagar is the law, Mount Sinai, right? The Old Covenant. And then that Sarai is the Jerusalem above, or the church historic and the church eschatological, or the, however you want to say that.
Right.
The invisible church, if that's how you want to say it. So he's not wrong. Like, he's playing on a distinction that is there. Interesting, though. Very interesting. But the thing that he says there that I would like to hit on that's important, there are various applications of this passage, which we covered in this morning's sermon. We won't rehash those here. But there are various applications to this passage. But the one that matters the most, that everybody can agree upon, is that we need to have spiritual circumcision, or circumcision of the heart, is what Scripture calls it. Now, what does it mean to have a circumcised heart? Well, what is literal circumcision? It's the cutting off of the flesh and casting it away, right? We need to do that with our flesh, right? Our fleshly desires, our sin.
And we need to be careful here that we're not getting into a Gnostic, flesh is good, flesh is bad, spirit is good.
That's right.
Kind of argument.
That's right. Yeah, we're definitely not arguing for that. What we're saying is that there are good, virtuous, bodily things that we can do. We're talking about sinful desires when we talk about flesh.
Flesh is not a literal flesh.
No, it's a metaphor for sinful desire.
Exactly.
That's right. And so that's what this thing is symbolizing, ultimately. The cutting off of the flesh and casting it off. And so we need to be doing that spiritually. So how does that happen spiritually? How do we become people who have circumcised hearts? Well, it's by being united, as Paul talks about in Colossians chapter 2, I think that it was, to the circumcision of Christ. What is that? Him being cut off for our sins.
Right. So we are, just as in the circumcision here, part of the flesh is cut off. Now, if you have, we'll go a little bit different route here. If you have an appendage that is cut off, right? Say your finger is cut off. It no longer receives blood flow.
It's true.
What happens to it?
It dies.
It dies. So what is cut off dies. Now, how does that relate to us, though? Well, let's look at our baptism, right?
Yep.
In our baptism, we die to ourselves, and we are raised to the newness of life.
That's right.
It's the same thing here with the circumcision and the baptism, at risk of getting us down an entirely different trail that we don't have time for.
But they are ultimately symbolizing the same thing,
right?
Like we have casted off the flesh, and we have been united to the circumcision of Christ, and now we are walking as new people.
Right.
They are symbolizing the same thing, and both are marks of the covenant. So
So we've covered those 2 chapters now.
Yeah.
Next week, we're going to have Travis preaching, and he's going to be starting in Genesis 18.
Yeah, I think he's going to be preaching. Let me see what passage it is.
I can't remember. It's at least the Abram's visitors.
Yeah.
And the section where Sarah laughs, I think.
Yeah, he's got 1 through 21.
Okay, so he has the Abram's plea for Sodom as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what Travis is going to be touching on next week. So, is there anything else you want to bring up on these passages this week? I know normally we save it to the end to show where Christ is found in the passage, but we kind of sprinkled it throughout this time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's nothing else that I would want to say. You know, ultimately, circumcision points to Christ. He's cut off as well. Mm-hmm. He's outside the camp, where the refuge of Israel was thrown outside the walls.
Right.
And so that's a part of the him being cut off, beyond the camp stuff as well. There's other things to that as well, but Christ is cut off for us, and that's how circumcision points to him.
Okay. So if you all have any questions about where we've been so far in Genesis, if you have any questions about circumcision, about how that relates to baptism, if you have any questions about the big topic we discussed in our service this morning, which is covenant theology, any questions about any of that, feel free to let us know. You can comment them here on the video on Facebook or on YouTube. You can send us an email. Go to our website, newhavenwv.com, click the Resources tab, and then click Talks at New Haven, and there'll be a form there where you can submit an email, or you can send them directly to us on our Instagram at Talks at New Haven. We have an off-topic episode of the podcast coming out this week.
Yep.
It'll be audio only, coming out Thursday. And it is part 1 in our
revival
tentatively planned 4-part, but possibly more series
see.
On revival and revivalism.
Yeah. So should be interesting. The first episode, we just kind of dipped our toes in the water and was like 40-some minutes, and we've got a lot more to say, but interesting primer to that topic of revival and revivalism.
Yep. So make sure that you are subscribed to our podcast feed so that you can get those. Like I said, those are audio only. We don't release video on those.
Yeah.
Mainly because while we record those, we have a giant box of cakes on the table that we're eating snacks.
That's right. We're eating snacks.
We don't need video of that getting out.
Best video evidence of that everywhere. Us downing the Little Debbies. Also, let me say this. We have our New Haven sermons back up online. It's been a little while since we've updated them, but we wanted this year to try to get those back on track. So the past 2 weeks' sermons, Derek's sermon audio from last week and my sermon audio from this morning, both of those are on our app. You can find that, or our podcast. You can find that everywhere that you find Talks at New Haven Apple.
And there's a link to all of that on our website. If you're struggling to find it, just go to our website, New Haven WV, and there's a link under I think the Resources tab is where the link is for all of that. Yeah,
if you want to search both of them, it's easy to remember. One is Talks at New Haven, the other is Sermons at New Haven. So if you want sermons, type in Sermons at New Haven. If you want Talks at New Haven, type in Talks. Yep. Easy to remember.
So that's all that I've got for you this week. Yeah. We'll be back next week digging into Genesis 18.
Yeah, getting into the Sodom and Gomorrah stuff.
Probably be starting a little bit later next week, starting about 7 o'clock. And I think Travis is going to be joining us next week. So it's not going to be just me and Josh talking this time. We'll get a third person to sit in and talk about random things as well.
Yeah, that should be good. Should be good. Should be fun times. So
that's all I've got. I will see you all next week.
See you then.